Hi guys, welcome to the recap show. Today's movie recap will cover a 2010 thriller movie named Terror Trap. Sit back, grab a drink, and enjoy. Terror Trap's first scene reveals a deceased woman lying on the grass with flies buzzing all around her. In the next scene, a group of people is seen at a funeral, some with tears in their eyes. As the pastor says the memorial prayers, a flash scene shows a girl trying to look outside a fuzzy window as she keeps hearing screams. Up next, a hot young lady drives her car on a lonely road at night. She's on a phone call and fails to notice she's already sped faster than the speed limit. She races past a cop car that pursues her and forces her to stop. Upon stopping, Sydney puts on some makeup and waits for the cop to come to her car. When he does, Sydney asks the cop what she did wrong. The cop tells her exactly what she did wrong and she apologizes. Unfortunately for her, he stylishly checks around her car and sees a bottle of wine and some red liquid. He immediately asks her to step out of the car. When she refuses, he yanks her out of her car and tells her she'd have to spend the night with him in a motel down the road, or else she'd have to go to jail for the night. Sydney pleads with the man to let her get home safely. However, the cop wasn't getting any of that as he told her to choose between the motel or jail. Left with no choice, Sydney takes the motel. In the next scene, Jonas gets a visit from his friend Carter. They both greet each other and get to discussing business. Apparently, Jonas had issues with some Mexicans crossing the border to the US and needed Carter's help to make that happen. Carter gets annoyed and nearly punches his friend when he mentions that kids were on board the truck. He shortens Jonas's offer and pays him $250 as opposed to $500 on the condition that he lets the kids go. In the next scene, a couple, Dawn and Nancy, drive through a dark road on their vacation. Nancy yawns loudly after working on her computer, much to the disapproval of her husband. Dawn lets her know he highly disapproves of her working while they're supposed to be on vacation. Nancy acts up and insults her husband for caring about her. She even tells him the website that got them rich years ago was stupid. This annoys Dawn, who acts maturely and corrects his wife, who takes it the wrong way. After a few minutes of back and forth argument on the road, Dawn ignores his apologetic wife and focuses on the road. Dawn tries to stop his wife and ends up crashing into an oncoming car. Now at a halt, the car pulls back and rams them once again, rendering their own car useless and undrivable. The couple stays on the road for an hour until a familiar cop, the one that drove Sydney to the motel earlier, named Cleveland, stops by and offers to help them. He chills off and tells them that they have no choice but to follow him to a motel to stay the night while he gets their car towed the next day. When the couple realizes they have no choice, they follow a cop to the Royal Vista Motel. When they stop in front of the motel, Nancy sighs at the state of the motel. Apparently, it wasn't clean enough for her standards. She tries calling 911, but Cleveland tells them that they can't get any emergency services on scene at the moment. Eventually, the couple gets their asses out of Cleveland's car to the receptionist. They get into the weird-looking motel and are attended to by Jonas, the receptionist. As usual, Nancy runs her mouth complaining until they get a room for the night. When the receptionist hands them the credit card and tells them they're room number 4, they leave immediately. Meanwhile, a real cop arrives at the scene of the couple's accident, but doesn't find any car there. Seems like Cleveland and his boys had already towed the couple's car to cover the tracks. Well, let's find out. Now in their motel room, Dawn and Nancy argue over where to sleep. Nancy keeps complaining about the horrible living conditions in the room, and Dawn keeps up with his crazy wife. After getting enough arguments for a night, Nancy finds bloodstains on the wall. She calls Dawn's attention to it and steps out for some air. She gets back inside and tells him they have to leave very early, so they have to get some sleep quickly. Fast forward to the night. Jonas and Cleveland are seen in a small control office preparing to start some show. When Jonas logs into his computer, he sets things up. In the next scene, Carter is seen receiving calls from customers for the show he, Cleveland, and Jonas were all planning. Back in the motel room, Dawn teases his wife about the dirty living conditions of the room he was in. He makes a joke about the one-way mirror that was in their camera. Elsewhere, an unidentified man gets up from bed and receives a text telling him to open the red room that the show was about to begin. Meanwhile, Dawn and Nancy finally settle down to sleep. Before sleeping, the duo has a moment that almost turns into a good bed thingy for the night. However, Nancy gets up and personal about why she's so angry at her husband. She tells him she couldn't control the anger she felt for Dawn doing what he did to her back then. They both hear screaming and a thud in the room next to theirs. Dawn and Nancy try to ignore the situation next door, but the screams keep getting louder. When they couldn't bear it anymore, Dawn gets to the next room and asks the neighbor to keep the screaming down. The neighbor adheres to his request and gets back to his thing. Dawn returns to his wife and continues sleeping. At that moment, A client/viewer arrives on scene to watch the torture of the unsuspecting city birds, Don and Nancy. When he pays his dues, Jonas gets to his other business, human trafficking. He shows his next customer a van full of girls from Ukraine and asks for $1,000 per girl. The customer grumbles and pays before getting his merchandise. A few hours into the night, Don and Nancy hear the loud scream yet again. Don gets out of the room to talk to the neighbor again. However, when he gets out this time, he senses a weird aura in the atmosphere. Back at Jonas's office, he gets a signal that everybody was ready to watch the show. He smiles as he gives a signal to kickstart the entire thing. Don checks through the window of his next-door neighbor and sees Sydney's body sitting on a chair. Don immediately switches to survival mode as he rushes back to his motel room and blocks the door. Just then, a group of masked men dressed in black run towards their door with weapons in their hands, ready to entertain the maniacal clients who enjoy watching torture and suffering. Before getting to the door, they disappear, giving Don and Nancy the impression that the coast was clear. If they only knew it wasn't. Don and Nancy quietly walk outside their room to get to their car. Unfortunately for them, the masked men appear from all sides of the parking lot to attack them. Don and his wife run into another room and lock the door behind them. Just then, the phone rings. Don picks up the call and hears Cleveland on the other end. Cleveland explains to them that they're at his mercy now and he would do whatever he pleases with them. Now fully aware of the danger they're in, Don leads Nancy out of the room and walks quietly to the car parked beside the motel. The masked men appear behind them, causing them to race to the car. Sadly for them, the car blew up right before they could get in. They immediately run back into the room where Nancy hugs her husband for the first time in the movie. As they kiss and make up, the phone rings again. Don picks it up this time and listens to Cleveland laugh over their situation. Even measly Jonas joins in on the conversation and gloats about how easy it was to pull this show off. Tired of their BS, Don hangs up the call and gets an idea. He decides to call emergency services using the same phone Don called him with. When someone picks up, the person, who has a familiar voice, tells them about the car they towed so the authorities don't catch up to them. Don tries to pay Cleveland off, but this doesn't work. Soon enough, they're at an impasse. In another scene, Carter gets his share of the cut for the show. He smells the blood money as he called it and keeps it. When it's time to split the cut between Jonas and Cleveland, things almost go out of hand. Thankfully, it doesn't, as Jonas gives Cleveland every cent he owes him. Up next, a fire truck stops by to put out the fire from the burning car that exploded a while ago. Nancy and Don quickly jump to action as they thought the fireman would be a legit one. Unfortunately, he wasn't. The fireman walks behind them and almost chokes Don to death. Thankfully, Nancy helps out and saves her husband. The two then fight another assailant and make a run for another room as the others keep coming from the shadows. Don and Nancy get into a room and keep the intruders out. Don tells Nancy to escape from the window to get help while he holds the bad guys out. Nancy gets out of the window and Don takes out one of their assailants. Nancy gets to another car, but is knocked out and captured by another assailant, all while to the excitement of the onlookers. When things die down, Don sneaks outside his room to their towed car to find some stuff. He spots someone coming out of a room in the front, ducks out of sight, and attacks the guy from behind. A struggle between the two lands Don in Jonas's office. Measly Jonas begs Don for help as he promises to give him Cleveland if he spares his life. He tells Don where his own pistol was. Don retrieves the pistol and shoots Jonas in the head before getting to look for the other culprits. Before he makes it out, he's assaulted by a bunch of other guys. Don goes all James Bond on the assailants as he throws, shoots, and fights his way to the viewing room. Upon seeing the sickos who are enjoying seeing them suffer, Don takes out a few of them and sees Cleveland taking his wife out of a room to his cop car. Don engages Cleveland in a gunfight, but Cleveland fights back. He parks his car and keeps fighting the protective husband. A few punches and kicks later, Don takes out Cleveland, the kingpin. Now that their ordeal is over, Don reunites with his wife and hides out of sight. A few minutes later, Carter walks out of his own office with a briefcase. He sees Cleveland lying down helpless on the ground, takes him out, and walks away. In the next and final scene, a group of people gathers in a cemetery to mourn Sydney's death. Before ending the memorial service, a half-bald man shares his condolences to the family. Carter, on the other hand, burns his bridges with his old associate. Thanks for watching, guys! Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to receive future recaps.